In this JavaScript language category, we are discussing one more question related to functions. The question is, how does a closure work in JavaScript? There will be two relative questions. So let's begin. Ideally, when a function comes under another function, a closure is created. Closure pattern remembers outer variable and also helps to access outer scope members. These terms might sound little confusing, but as we go on, you will have a clear idea on it. We will start with a simple example. I will create a function called outer, and another function I am creating is inner. Let's try to display some value, let's say inner called. Now if I want to call this function outside the outer function, this is not possible. The reason is outer function we have in the current scope, but inner is actually the child of outer. So even if you try to call this function outside outer, it won't be possible. Let's check this, what actually happens. As you see that it gives an error. It says that inner is not defined because the current scope for inner function is inside the outer. In any case, if you want to call this, you might write the inner function here. So what happens that when you call the outer function, it is going to call the inner and that will give you the output. Let's say I run the code and yes, it does execute. There is also another way to call the inner function here. Let's try that. In previous question, we discussed about function expression also. It will be somewhat like function expression. I am removing this inner, and what will I do is I will return the reference of inner function. Remember, I am not writing parentheses here. Instead, I am just saying that I want to return the inner function, and that function I can take in a variable called CL, which is actually a constant. It is an object, and I call the outer function. Now what outer does is outer calls the function and it returns the inner function to CL. So you can say, in other words, it is something like this, that const CL is equal to function inner, like a function expression. So now you can call this inner function using CL, isn't it? The same thing is happening when this line number 7 is executed. Now I'm going to call the function CL. Let's run and see what happens now. Now the inner function is called. So what have we done here? We just try to return the inner. So inner was actually a private member, but we returned it in such a way that it can have access outside the outer function's scope. The same thing you can write without a name as well. Like you can remove this name and even you can remove this return statement. We can say that I'm going to return the anonymous function. I can say return here. This is also a valid syntax. Return, that is. So if I run, it's going to be the same. You can also try the ES6 syntax, that is arrow function, with this entire code. Let's convert this into ES6. I'll say outer is equal to, we don't need function here, we don't even need the name here. I'll put an arrow here. In this return also, we won't need the function, and again an arrow. If you compare the previous or this code, at least for this execution, there is no change. The output is going to be the same. But now we are using the ES6 syntax. So these are the different ways of writing the same thing. But this returning the function is important to know. Now in the beginning, I mentioned that a closure pattern can remember outer variables. How is it so? Let's check with an example. I'm going to create a function called add counter, where I have a counter 0, and then I try to increment the value of counter and I want to return the counter. Let's also put a console log, and because this function is returning the counter, I'm just going to call the function. So every time a console log is executed with add counter, it's going to add the counter and it should give me the new result. That's what I'm expecting. Let's run this. As you see the output, every time it says 1. The reason is when you call the function, it's going to reinitialize this counter with value 0, and then we increment it and we return. So 0, 1 is added and we return the counter. So every time we are going to get the same result. Now if you want that every time it should be added, then what you can do, you can put this variable above all the functions. That is, you can make it global variable. But imagine that you do not want to make this variable global and still you want that the output should be 1, 2, 3 and so on. How can you do this? So this can be achieved using a closure. If we create an inner function, we can make a private variable counter act as a global variable. Let's implement this. I'm going to say return. So the function I'm returning, remember that I'm using arrow function syntax, but it can be the traditional way also, doesn't matter. I'm just putting these statements inside the inner function. And here what will I do? I'll say const closure is equal to add counter, and instead of calling the add counter, I'm going to call now the CL. That is the inner function. You name it whatever you want to. It's just a simple function. This is what the code is. Now I will run and see what is the output. Now you see that we have 1, 2 and 3. So in the beginning I mentioned that you can make local variables act as a global variable, which you see that it happens here. What exactly is happening? This function, which is the inner function of add counter, certainly this counter variable for this function is a global variable because the counter is above the inner function. Because this is a global variable for inner function, every time it increments, it is going to keep the value in the JavaScript environment. In fact, there is something like this environment. It's a variable which keeps the detail of current environment. So the variable is stored there, and every time we call CL, we are going to get the new value. So now the value is not reset. It is the previous value. It remembered the value. So ideally, when you use closure, that means you are making the private members globally available, but with a cause, right? You should have some idea why you do it. Not every time you put closure. Closure is useful when you have few private members which you do not want that outer function should access. You keep it private, and only when needed, only in few situations, you write a closure and you make the value global this way. Let's discuss about the relative question. The first question is, how can you access private variable or a function outside the scope? So we can do that using closure. We have already seen earlier that we return the function without parentheses and we can achieve it. The second question is, explain the advantages of a closure. Now this is a very important question. You should have a clear idea about what a closure is, how we could achieve few things, how we could achieve accessing of global variable, that you can explain. That is the main advantage of closure, is that any member which is private for certain scope can be accessed, keeping it private so that the variable is away from any accidental change of value. Accessing private members with a closure pattern assure better approach of making a variable global.